When I was a small boy, maybe 8 or 9 or so, we had a neighbor across the street named Mr. McClusky. He was an old man, a recent widower who lived alone, and I don't think he had any children, or at least I don't remember anyone ever visiting him. My primary memory of him at that time was that he was sad and lonely, and my mother always told my brother and me to be very nice to him should we see him around the neighborhood. After his wife died, Mr. McClusky liked to walk up and down our road, which he would do for hours a day it seemed, kind of shuffling along in an old, saggy bathrobe and slippers. He would always keep his head straight down when he walked, staring absent-mindedly at his feet rather than at where he was going. But sometimes he would stop in front of our house and just stand there like he was arguing with someone even though he was alone. And though he was perfectly silent, his hands in particular would become so agitated and tense that they would tremble and shake, repeatedly balling up and bursting open, before he would eventually settle himself and go back to plodding up and down the road over and over again. My brother and I used to secretly watch him from our living room's big windows when we knew our mother wouldn't catch us. I guess we thought of him as kind of this harmless zombie, too old and sad to actually do anything particularly gruesome, or even anything at all really. But this one time was different. It was in early October and the leaves were starting to come down little by little. My mother had gone to the grocery store, leaving my brother and me at home. Mr. McClusky was of course trudging back and forth outside. When he happened to stop in front of our house, my brother and I watched him, peeking from the side of the windows like a couple of spies. He stood there like that for quite some time, his long greasy hair hiding the side of his downcast face, but then his whole body seemed to erupt with movement. He began to furiously shake his head, kind of rattling it around and hitting at his ears with open hands, before slowly and mechanically turning to our house. I was startled and jerked away. My brother did the same. Then when I glanced back, Mr. McClusky was suddenly closer, right in the middle of the yard, his head and hands still weirdly twitching while the rest of him remained absolutely motionless. I yanked back again, my heart thumping. My mother was due back any moment now, I thought, but still I was terrified. I imagined that underneath his drab robe, his body was like that of a corpse, covered with suppurating wounds and wet, dark scabs. I decided that when I peered again, he would be gone, vanished. I was sure of it. But no, he was right outside the window now, by the bushes that would flower in the early summer. His eyes were cold and empty, but I noticed, right before I bolted to my room, that he was smiling this hideously enormous smile that seemed to gnarl and deform his face. My mother, of course, didn't believe us when we told her about the incident. In fact, she said she was severely upset with us for concocting this horrible story, telling us that possibly we had misunderstood what had happened, that Mr. McClusky was very old and also very sad now that Mrs. McClusky was gone, and that he had more than likely just wandered away from the road and ended up in front of our windows. I sheepishly asked my mother what had happened to Mrs. McClusky, having heard that there was some sort of mystery about it, but my mother wouldn't answer me, thinking perhaps that I was just trying to distract her from chastising us. Soon after, my mother got a second job that kept her from home for about an hour after my brother and I returned from school in the afternoon. She was very strict about what we could and couldn't do in her absence, and one of her restrictions was that we couldn't go outside while she was away at work. This we obeyed for about a week, but then we started riding our bikes around the neighborhood. At first it was just one quick lap, and then 2 and 3 and so on, and it was on one of our clandestine rides near Halloween when we saw Mr. McClusky for the final time. We hadn't actually seen anything of him since he was at our window, and my mother had worriedly mentioned that perhaps someone should go and check in on him. But here he was again, his appearance shabbier than ever and more ghostly. My brother and I braked our bikes hard upon first seeing him in the road, about 15 yards from where we stopped. Our mother was due back soon, so we needed to get home, but we just stood there, watching the slumped figure of Mr. McClusky slowly approach, dragging his slippers along the crumbling asphalt, his arms dead at his sides. Without notice, my brother wheeled his bike around and took off in the opposite direction, leaving me stranded. Everything in my mind screamed to escape, but I couldn't. I don't know why, but I was frozen where I was as Mr. McClusky came closer and closer, his head down at his chest as if his neck didn't work, moving so lifelessly it was like he was sleepwalking. When he finally came upon me, I thought I would throw up, I was so scared. He stopped beside me, turning his head sideways, and I saw again that same hideous smile he flashed at us at the windows. He yanked my arm down with quick violence and said, "Do you know what I did? Would you like me to tell you? I chopped up Mrs. McClusky with my little axe. I did, truly I did. I chopped her up into little bits with my little axe, and she screamed the whole time, shrieking and squealing as my little axe cut her into nice little pieces. She screamed, 'Henry, oh Henry, listen please, Henry.' But my little axe wouldn't listen. She screamed, Listen, Henry, as I chopped her little neck. Listen, Henry, as I chopped her little arms. Listen, Henry, as I chopped her little feet and little legs and little head. She wouldn't stop screaming, listen, Henry. Even after I chopped her all up into sections and slices you wouldn't recognize as human. She's still screaming to this day, up in my house. Screaming and shrieking and squealing. Listen, Henry. Oh, Henry, listen. Day and night she'll still screaming in there. But I can't hear her anymore, thank Christ. She was giving me headaches, you see. And it was my little axe that told me what to do. Here, I'll show you. He reached into the pockets of his robe and showed me 2 severed ears. He grabbed one of my hands and thrust them into my palm. The ears were moldy looking, raw and fungal, and still slightly warm. I looked up and noticed that the sides of his head were sticky with blood. I dropped the ears to the ground and biked home as fast as I could, Mr. McClusky still laughing behind me. We never saw him again after that. Needless to say, neither my mother nor my brother believed me when I first told them what Mr. McClusky had confessed. He apparently died that same night in his house, and rotted there until the stench was unmistakable a week later. Ambulances, fire trucks, and police cars crowded our road for hours, and I will always remember the look my mother gave me that day, a look that said, I should have listened to you. Because along with the decaying body of Mr. McClusky, they found pieces of Mrs. McClusky in the house and buried all over the backyard. They also found Mr. McClusky's ears thrown away in the trash.